Hello everybody, and I know a lot of faces, but for those that I don't, it's lovely to meet you virtually. This is the Birthplace Museum where I work, which I'm sure many of you have been to before. If you haven't, come along when we're open, please, if you can. And tonight I'm going to be talking about some items from our collection. Now, we've got around 2,000 items in our collection. Around 100 of them have a direct link to Lawrence. So I'm just going to talk, I've just cherry-picked a few to talk about tonight and tell you about why I think they're special. Firstly, I have to say that I think objects are magic. They tell us stories, they give us an insight into the past and the people connected with them. And I know from my experience of working with visitors to the museum that they can evoke emotion in a really powerful way. And I came across a quote of Lawrence's which shows that he shared that feeling. I'll just read that out for you. He said, "Things men have made with wakened hands and put soft life into are awake through years with transferred touch and go on glowing for long years. And for this reason, some old things are lovely, warm still with the life of forgotten men who made them." Which I think is a really beautiful piece. But then, of course, I came across another quote from Lawrence which completely contradicted that. He said, "Museums, museums, museums, object lessons rigged out to illustrate the unsound theories of archaeologists, crazy attempts to coordinate and get into a fixed order that which has no fixed order and will not be coordinated. It is sickening. Why must all experience be systematized? A museum is not a first-hand contact, it is an illustrated lecture, and what one wants is the actual vital touch." So, tut-tut, Lawrence, very rude about my chosen profession. It's always the way with Lawrence. You find one thing and then you find something that completely contradicts it. But anyway, I'm going to choose to believe that he believed in the first saying more. So the first item I've got to show you is his headstone. Soon after Lawrence's burial in Vence in the south of France in 1930, his widow Frida commissioned this simple headstone to place on his grave. It's a plaster-covered stone slab with a mosaic of a phoenix rising from its ashes, which was the writer's iconic emblem. And it strikes me as both odd and incredibly fitting. There are no words engraved on it, which I think is ironic for a writer's memorial. The image is made up of different coloured pebbles from one of the beaches at Bandol, and the mosaic was designed by an Italian artisan. We don't have Lawrence, incidentally. It'd be nice if we did. There are a couple of stories as to what actually happened to his remains, and apologies for those of you who've heard this story many, many times. I'm going to tell it anyway. One of the theories is that Frida had his ashes taken to a little shrine in New Mexico that she had built, where they once had a ranch. And it's a nice story, and I hate to take away another site's claim to fame, but it's probably not true. There's another theory, and that is that Frida's third husband, Angelo Rivali, was commissioned with bringing the ashes back. He admitted at a dinner party many years later that he had in fact thrown the ashes overboard into the sea. And as he'd run out of money on the journey back, I think that's quite likely. He probably couldn't afford the customs charge. There's another one of the shrine. So it's you know, it's possible that they're there, but I think it's more likely that it was thrown into the ocean. But the headstone itself, let me just go back to it. Still had a journey to follow, what you might call an afterlife. Following Lawrence's exhumation in March 1935, the headstone was retrieved by an English resident of Vence, and in 1939 she returned to England and brought the headstone with her, and it eventually found a permanent home with us at the DH Lawrence Birthplace Museum. And this in itself is a curious little aside story. The resident of Vance who took possession of the stone was a one Martha Gordon Crotch, and she'd befriended Frida following Lawrence's death. Now, Crotch had survived a medical mishap some years prior when a pair of 5-inch nickel-plated surgical forceps were left in her abdomen by the surgeon who performed the operation. When they were subsequently removed, Crotch displayed the forceps with the maker's stamp still visible on them in her tea room, the Pigeoneer, along with the headstone. So even then, the headstone was part of this cabinet of curiosities. When Martha returned to England in 1939, she brought the headstone with her, and she attempted to sell it for £200 to a Professor Vivian de Sola Pinto, a Lawrence scholar and a professor of English at Nottingham University. Pinto didn't want to buy it, but he was later contacted by a hotel outside London where Martha had abandoned it before her return to Vance. And so he brought it to Eastwood, and these acts ensured that it survived, it survived destruction, and it came to Eastwood, and it's allowed, countless visitors to come and see it and engage with the story. For many years it was on display at Eastwood Library, but it eventually found its way to us, and it's an object it's got its own interesting history, and it's tied up with the intrigue surrounding Lawrence's last resting place. Next item I want to talk to you about is Lydia's bonnet. So this bonnet was donated to the museum for its opening in 1976. There had been some publicity about the museum being set up, and there was a call out for donations. And the donor came forward with this bonnet. So the bonnet had belonged to the donor's mother, whose name was Mrs. Levers. And the donor's father and DH Lawrence were friends. And they lived on Victoria Street at the same time that the Lawrences did, and Mrs. Lawrence claimed to have brought it from Lydia at that time. There was a Levers family who ran the Star Livery Stables, business next door to 8A, almost certainly them. And the Star Livery Stables was a horse-drawn carriage service for which we've got an original advertisement in our collection. Cabs, dog carts, brakes, wagonettes. The museum itself, if you go out into the backyard to where the wash house is, you can see where the old hayloft to this business would be. And it seems like this Levers family, they were quite a big part of the community. I've got another piece in the collection. This is a photograph that depicts a W. Levers Boys Club outing in 1914 at the top of Victoria Street. And it's lovely to have these bits of evidence already in the collection. They add weight to the provenance, and they also help to build a story around how the two families might have been linked. So the bonnet itself, it's handmade and it's very fine work. And we know that Lydia made these kinds of items herself. We can be fairly sure that this is indeed her handiwork. It's very skilled and it shows real attention to detail. Although the fabric is much degraded by light damage, it is possible to see the delicate patterning on the fabric. If you look at the close-up, it would originally have been a pale cream with tiny blue stars. It's a pity about the light damage. The fabric, it's extremely fragile. It literally disintegrates if it's sort of, you can't hold it with your hands because it would just fall apart more. So it was retired to storage because it was too fragile to be out on display or handled. But recently I took it to the Conservation Department of Lincoln University, They've got some marvellous conservation equipment and the skills to, if not reverse the damage, at least stabilise the material and protect it against any further deterioration. And just to illustrate what artefacts would look like without the kind of light damage that just happens over hundreds of years naturally, I've got a picture of the state bed at Cork Abbey. I don't know if you've ever been, any of you. They've got this magnificent bed there. It's circa 1715. And it was a gift that was too large to be put up and installed. It was too tall. So it was boxed away and never used. And it wasn't even stored all that well. Apparently it was just wrapped in newspaper. But nevertheless, it survived in near pristine condition. If you have a look at the close-up, that's the vivid colours. And I think what would surprise us the most about the material culture, if we could step back in time, would be the vivid colours that were often used. So we can only imagine how lovely the bonnet would have been originally. And another idea, I don't know if it'll come to pass, but one thing I'd like to have done would be to have a replica made, one that could be handled and passed around, and also so you could see its, original beauty. One thing that puzzled me about the bonnet, despite my conviction that the provenance is genuine, was the fact that it appears to be earlier in style than the 1880s, when Lydia had her shop at 8A. But that was resolved after I went to Lincoln University and spoke to the experts there. They explained that it was very typical for fashions in more provincial towns, such as Eastwood, which still had strong links with the countryside, to lag behind the bigger towns by as much as 20 years. In the fashions. So it's also entirely possible that Lydia, who previous to moving to Eastwood, she'd earned a living through her hands working in the lace industry. She may well have made the bonnet at an earlier time. Whatever the case, it seemed entirely in keeping to me that Lydia would have sold this exquisitely made, if rather old-fashioned item from her parlour window between 1883 and 1887. And what's so wonderful about having these different sources to tell us the story of the object is that it also tells us something about what Eastwood was like at the time. And that fits perfectly well with how Lawrence described the area. He said in Nottingham and the mining country, "To me as a child and a young man, it was still the old England of the forest and agricultural past. There were no motor cars. The mines were, in a sense, an accident on the landscape, and Robin Hood and his merry men were not very far away." So it just all dovetails together really nicely, those little bits of information with that story. And next I'm moving on to Lady Chatterley's Lover. We've got lots of copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover in our collection, some really interesting ones, and this is a first edition of the 1960 version. And Lady Chatterley's Lover, it's got one of the most complicated publication histories of any novel, I think. Lawrence first had it printed privately in Italy in 1928, but it wasn't until 32 years later that the full unexpurgated version was published in Britain. And the 1960 Penguin publication became the centre of a hugely famous trial, and it was a watershed moment in British cultural history. But between 1928 and 1960, there were many pirate editions of the novel. Even in Lawrence's lifetime, he was infuriated by these pirate editions that he wasn't earning any pennies from. So he had the Paris Popular edition published in an attempt to beat the pirates. You can see here my skirmish with Jolly Roger. But of all the copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover that we've got in our collection, this one is my favourite. It looks nothing, I know. It's classically backed in brown tape. It's got no identifying features other than a little attribution on the back that says it was published by the Times Press in Lahore. And further researchers, we've pretty much pinned it down to 1931. And I think what I love about this object so much is that it looks so unprepossessing, but the story behind it is just so wonderful. And the donor was able to give me a lot of information around it. It belonged to the donor's father, and the donor wrote to me and he said, you may be interested to know that in one of my father's diaries, and he wrote a page a day from the age of 18 until 84, I have come across a long and interesting essay on his changing opinion of Lady C over those years, and in it this sentence. I remember very clearly the first time I read Lady C. It was in 1931 when I was 24. I was lent a copy of the novel that had been smuggled into England from Paris. Reading it was for me a most liberating experience. And the donor said that he suspected the smuggler was his godfather, in whose will it was bequeathed to him. And actually the full passage from that diary is worth reading. So I'm going to read that for you now. Herbert Scarborough, writing of his first reading of Lady Chatterley's Lover. This was written in April 1983, 6 months before his death at the age of 84. I remember very clearly the first time I read Lady C. It was in 1931 when I was 24. I was lent a copy of the novel that had been smuggled into England from Paris. Reading it was for me a most memorable, liberating experience. I was then a virgin, feeling rather painfully the pains of virginity. At the same time, I was in the process of casting off some of the constricting beliefs in which I had been reared. The sexual acts of Mellors and the lady, presented in language of extraordinary power and poetry, seemed to crystallise from the pages into an actuality that was quite breathtaking. I felt at once what Lawrence would have called the purity of the writing. I could not have talked to anyone about these scenes, yet I could feel that they had the magic and mystery of a religious experience. It was the sons of God with the daughters of man, and of this they would never speak. This writing seemed to me to belong to that class of writing which alters the reader's own understanding of life, like Hamlet or War and Peace. And here's a picture. It's not terribly good quality, but this is a picture of Herbert from around the time he would have first read the novel. Isn't he lovely? And there are a couple of little details about this copy which I quite like too, being a bit geeky. One is that there's it's got the same spelling errors in as the original first edition that Lawrence had published. So these spelling errors, they mirror the original. The original had them because the typesetters and printers didn't speak any English. And Lawrence said of that ignorance is bliss. And also, so as you can see, I'll just show you what I'm actually talking about. And a woman had to yelled instead of a woman had to yield. There are several throughout the book that just little misspellings. And the other one is, and again, apologies for the quality of this, that one I took it on my phone. You can see that it's slightly out of alignment, the typesetting as well. And I had intended to come along with a few objects that you could actually handle, and had that been the case, you'd be able to handle it and feel that the quality of the paper, it's not as good as book quality paper. It's more like magazine quality paper. So all these little bits again add up to it being a pirate edition. But I did do a little bit of research online and found that, you know, that there was a publication place in India at the time in the 1930s, and they're actually quite a radical left-wing press as well, and I wondered if the two might have been connected. Left-wing press, Lady Chatterley's Lover being pirated there. I don't know, I've not established for certain. And I'll just go back a minute, sorry. But the novel is so tied up with the cultural, moral and intellectual history of this country that its significance can't be overestimated. I've met so many people who've had an anecdote about reading the novel, or for whom it was like Herbert, reading it was a liberating experience. And this particular copy, it's got such a wonderful kind of corroborating story behind it, which illustrates the significance and the impact that the novel had. And the next one is the travel trunk. So Lawrence and Frida used this trunk on their travels. There's a record of them taking 4 trunks on one such trip from Italy to Ceylon, which turned into a journey around the world. Lawrence described the 4 trunks as 1 household trunk, 1 book trunk, F's and mine. The author's initials are clearly marked on 3 sides. At first appearance, the exterior seems like leather, but an expert examination has revealed that it is in fact made from linoleum. The trunk was given to a local scout group by Lawrence's sister Ada in 1948, who then donated it to the museum. Apparently they'd been using it as a toboggan, which I think it's in remarkably good condition, bearing that in mind. And the trunk is evidence of Lawrence's absolute necessity to move. Lawrence travelled widely, even by today's standards, but back in the early 20th century, working class people rarely did. His travels began when he eloped to Germany with Frida, who was the wife of his languages professor. He trekked across the Alps, he lived in many different parts of Italy, he travelled to Ceylon, Australia, Mexico, lived for a while in New Mexico, and much more places besides. He was hugely influenced by the places that he went to, and he was able to capture the spirit of place, arguably better than any other writer. He left behind a body of travel writing, Twilight in Italy, Seeing Sardinia, Etruscan places. And he described Mexico as the greatest experience from the outside world that I've ever had. And one part of the Lawrence narrative that we didn't cover that much at the museum and wanted to expand upon more is his travels. And so we've become involved with the Earth Museum. It's a new project that we were just in the beginning of developing just before lockdown began. The trunk, among other objects, but the trunk features quite heavily in this project. And the Earth Museum is a free online portal. I'm just going to try and reduce this. Bear with. So this is the Earth Museum. We're not the only museum. There are lots of others who are taking part as well. And you can travel the world. There are themed tours. One is ours. And basically each red dot on the map is a place that Lawrence visited or is associated with Lawrence, and it has a bit of information about it. So that one there. And yeah, and the beauty is you can go all around the world. You can go over to New Mexico. Anyway, little aside. Where was I? Yeah, we want to use this in-house to fill in the gap in the narrative, so people can click on and see where it went around the world. And the online part was just a nice bonus, really. But with lockdown, this seems to be the way that a lot of museums are going. And I can honestly think that we're only going to be doing more of this kind of online project. Lawrence's appeal is global, and visitors to 8A Victoria Street, where it was born, come from quite literally all over the world. And with this online portal, we can connect with DH Lawrence fans around the world. They can find out more about an object, see stories, travel virtually, and we were quite keen to bring in some places alongside objects. Just keep an eye on the time. So this is, for example, the ranch that he and Frida lived in New Mexico. That's the exterior. I don't know if any of you have been lucky enough to go over there and see it. I hope one day I get to go and see it. There's the interior of it as well. And we can just expand on this forever and ever and ever. So there's, that's Dorothy Brett's cabin. This is Georgia O'Keeffe, where she stayed. So she did a pretty famous painting on the Lawrence tree. That's a lovely vista out there. So this is the Lawrence tree. And Lawrence described it as a big pine tree in front of the house, standing still and unconcerned and alive. And there are countless individuals whose connection we can explore, and we can utilise the museum's collection, but the collection is really just a starting point to expand upon the traditional narrative. So, this project is still in its infancy. We're having to put a lot more content up on there, but the potential is really great. I think I'm going to just skip over that. That's the painting that she did. The Lawrence tree, Georgia O'Keeffe. And then I'm going to move back to Eastwood and something we have with us. And this is the Lydia Lawrence dish. It's very simple. It's just a white 4-leaf clover shaped jam dish with a floral design. It was donated in 1976 by Maud Martin Thirlby. Her maiden name was Thistleby. And she lived next door to the Lawrences at Lincroft. The dish was brought from Eastwood Market on a Friday night for 3 or 6 pence, old money, by Mrs. Thirlby. And Lawrence was with her at the time, and he brought his mother one exactly the same. And it's just the kind of pretty little piece that Lydia liked, but was reluctant to buy for herself, judging by the character of Gertrude Morell in Sons and Lovers, who buys a very similar sounding dish for 5 pence from the Friday evening market. When she brings it home, she says to the young Paul Morell, "I'm a wicked, extravagant woman. I know I shall come to want." The dish and the story behind it, and the passage from Sons and Lovers, in which it's talked about, are too similar for there not to be a connection. The fictional dish had forget-me-nots on it, as does this one, among other flowers. And the mother and son discuss using it for jam or pickles. And it reinforces Gertrude's, aka Lydia's, character as someone who sacrificed and who was reluctant to spend money upon herself. And it's an example of the everyday intimacy between mother and son. It makes me wonder, did Lawrence have this in mind when he wrote it? I think you can say with some certainty that he did. The timing's right. Maud was a neighbour from the Lincroft house, so about the time he was writing it. And here's where the little nuggets of information that come with an object are so important. The dish is not particularly valuable, I mean, commercially, and it didn't even actually belong to the family, but the history of its purchase gives us a great deal of insight into the writing of Sons and Lovers and to Lawrence's writing in general. We know Sons and Lovers to be semi-autobiographical. Here you have an example of a real-life incident being changed slightly and used to build a layer of authenticity into the writing. So yeah, it's just another small insignificant item that the story behind it is what really makes it magic. That's just the back of it. And then the last item I'm going to show you today is the inkstand carved from coal, and actually carved by DH Lawrence himself. It was fairly common for people to carve items from coal. After all, in Eastwood at the time, it was practically a free resource for mining families. The top's got a wide groove to accommodate pens. There's a hole to accommodate an ink pot. The underside has got carved legs. The top side's been smoothed and varnished, although the underside is rough cut. So this inkstand was carved by DH Lawrence from a piece of coal and given to his cousin, John Lawrence of Heanor, with the words, "You can always put it on the fire if you're short of fuel." The inkstand was bequeathed to the donor who donated it to the museum in 1976. And that brings us very nicely back to that first lovely quote I said of Lawrence. I'm going to say it again. Things men have made with wakened hands and put soft life into are awake through years with transferred touch and go on glowing for long years. And for this reason, some old things are lovely, warm still with the life of forgotten men who made them. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation. I wasn't sure if I was going to run out of material because this is the first time I've presented this. So I did just stick on a few slides of the museum as well. But I'll blast through them really quickly and then we'll do the Q&A. But yeah, here's the other object is of course the museum itself and the space that it creates, which I think is magic. I've had some pretty amazing experiences in there with visitors over the years. There's the parlour, the kitchen. Feeling very nostalgic because it's all wrapped up at the moment. There's the bedroom, the most important room arguably because we believe it's the room that Lawrence was born in. The back bedroom where the children slept, the attic, and the wash house. And that's me. So yeah, I'm open for questions.